Hello y'all, welcome back to Casey Can Probably Read. My name is Casey and I've heard of books, mostly good things. Today I'm going to do a wrap up of the 5 books I read for Asian Readathon in the first half of May. So that's everything on or before May 15th. I'm really having a great reading month. I fulfilled 3 of the reading challenges for Asian Readathon and I'm already working on the last 2. Besides that, I've just read some really good books. While there are a few that I didn't love, the majority of the books that I've read so far have just been great. I'm having a great time over here. So I'm just gonna jump into it. The first book I read this month was Wicked As You Wish by Chupeco. I buddy read this with my friend Tabitha from We the Foxen. It was my first time doing a buddy read as a booktuber, and it's probably pretty lame to get excited about that, but I'm gonna do it anyway. A really weird thing happened while I was reading this. I started listening to it on audiobook on Spotify, but I also purchased the ebook version so I could read along because I have a hard time retaining world building information when I listen to fantasy books as audiobooks. So I listened to about 3 chapters on Spotify, and then I went to my ebook to skim it and make sure I didn't miss anything, and guess what? They were 2 completely different editions of the story. The Spotify audiobook version had a lot more exposition. A lot of that had been edited out of the ebook, so I checked with Tabitha to see which edition she had, and she said she had the international edition, which seemed to coincide with the audiobook. So that really messed with my head. It may have colored my experience with this book a little bit because it was very confusing to try to figure out why entire speeches were missing from my ebook. This story is set, I guess, in what you call an alternate universe where fairy tales actually historically happened. So while the story opens in a small town in Arizona, it's common knowledge in this version of the world that magic exists, as do countries like Wonderland and Avalon. The story mainly follows Tala McKeeling Warnock. Her family is originally from the country of Avalon, but their country was attacked by the Snow Queen several years before and completely covered in ice, so they're now living in Arizona. It is widely believed that the Snow Queen also murdered the entire royal family of Avalon, but at the beginning of the story, the last surviving Avalonian prince, who has been in hiding since Avalon was destroyed, comes to live in Tala's community. His name is Alex. It's Tala and her family's job to protect Alex until he turns 18, which is when the mythical Firebird is supposed to come and find him and help him find a way to free Avalon from the ice and retake his place on the throne. I think, to be honest, I am not sure how clear the information about the Firebird's relationship to the rulers of Avalon was. So Tala and Alex become BFFs. They attend high school together. On Alex's 18th birthday, their town gets attacked by the Snow Queen's forces, and they are thrust into a quest with a bunch of other Avalonian young people to free Avalon from its enchantment. Okay. I've already admitted that my confusion at the beginning with having 2 different editions of this book may have affected my reading experience. But the truth is, I didn't enjoy this book very much. There was a lot of exposition in this book, and I hate to use the word info dumping when it comes to fantasy because I think sometimes people like to label legitimately necessary world building information as info dumping. But in this case, I think that info dumping is probably the best word for it. Even in the more streamlined ebook version, where significant chunks of backstory were removed, it still bordered on too much. I really like the idea behind this book. I'm a big fan of fairy tales of all types, and I think an alternate universe where fairy tale history is world history is a very creative idea. But I got so bogged down in the exposition of this book that that's really all I remember about it. Honestly, if I hadn't been buddy reading this one, there's a good chance I probably would have DNF'd it. I'm still interested in reading more from Chupeco, however. I think I read somewhere that even though Wicked As You Wish is one of their more recently published works, it was actually written much earlier in their career. So Tabitha and I have talked about maybe buddy reading The Bone Witch sometime later this year. The next book I read was The Silence of Bones by June Her. This book is set in 1800 in Chosun, which later became Korea. Specifically, it's set right before the Shinyu persecution of Korean Catholics in 1801, during which hundreds of Catholic adherents were executed in Chosun. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that part of the story today, but these historical events and the accompanying political tension are pretty important to the story. The main character is a police damo named SEOUL, who is indentured to the police force in the capital city of Hanyang. She is an orphan. The only family she has in the world is her older sister, who lives in another town, and an older brother who left home many years before and who SEOUL believes is dead. The story kicks off when a noblewoman is found brutally murdered on the streets of Hanyang. SEOUL is assisting the police inspector who is in charge of the murder investigation. They grow to respect and trust each other and start to build a kind of friendship. But then the police inspector becomes a suspect in the murder. So SEOUL has to figure out who the murderer actually is, while also trying to figure out what happened to her missing brother all those years ago. This book was so captivating in the subtlest way. I really enjoyed the prose. I found it to be beautiful without being too flowery. Also, in my opinion, the resolution of the story was both poignant and bittersweet, and I really enjoyed reading this book. The next book I read was The Easy Life in KAMUSARI by Shion Miura. This book kind of snuck up on me. It started off slowly, and while it was pleasant, it wasn't what I'd call a gripping story. But the more I read it, the more I found myself in this quiet state of joy. It's nothing like the books I usually read. There wasn't an elaborate plot or anything, but it just made me feel good. The Easy Life in KAMUSARI is billed as a coming-of-age story. The main character is a recent high school graduate named Yuki Hirano. He's kind of aimless and doesn't really know what to do with his life, doesn't have any plans. So one day, out of the blue, his parents inform him that they found him a job, and they immediately put him on a train bound for KAMUSARI in the Japanese mountains. When Yuki gets to KAMUSARI, he discovers that he's been enrolled in a forestry training program. He is deeply unhappy about this turn of events, and he hates being in KAMUSARI, where there is no cell service or internet. He tries to leave and go back home several times, but in the end, he stays for an entire year. The book is basically Yuki recounting the events of his year in KAMUSARI, him learning how to care for trees on the mountain, him meeting the very eccentric residents of this mountain town, and him eventually carving out a place of his own among them. My favorite part of this story was the townspeople. Each of them was unique and vibrant, usually comical, and also endearing in some way. It didn't take me long to read this. It was pretty short, and it was just warm and wholesome. I loved it. The next book I read was American Soul by Helena Rowe. This is a memoir. Helena Rowe was born in South Korea, but her family moved away when she was 6 years old. They eventually made their way to the United States. Her dad was a surgeon, and her parents had wanted to have a son to carry on the family name. However, they never did have sons, only 4 daughters, including Rowe herself. Rowe became a pediatrician, and she worked at some pretty renowned hospitals with some pretty famous doctors. She married another doctor, a white man, but by the age of 40, some pretty major events had happened in her life that made her realize she no longer wanted to be a doctor. And so she left medicine to become a writer. Okay, this book was complicated for me. It was hard to put down, I will say that. The writing and the storytelling is very compelling, and I was definitely never disinterested in the book. There was something about the author's tone that felt a little, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, biased maybe. I mean, a memoir is a memoir. A person should be allowed to tell their own personal story the way that they remember it. That's fair. But the tone of this book didn't always hit for me. Also, I don't really know a lot about content warnings, if I'm honest, but I feel like this book maybe could have used some. I have an aloof appreciation of content warnings. I think they can be helpful, but I don't usually need them personally because I don't find myself triggered by the stuff I read usually. However, about 30 to 40% of the way through this book, I started to get incredibly anxious. It was a very strange experience. I actually had to stop and assess and ask myself, why do I feel like I'm having a stress response right now? And it turned out it was the book. I was surprised. Like I said, that doesn't usually happen to me, but this book was uniquely stressful to read. Now, I'm not going to say that it wasn't artful and that it didn't have redemptive moments, but if you are a person that needs to know ahead of time about triggering content in your books, I would be careful with this one. Just off the top of my head, we're talking sexual assault, physical abuse, and child death at least, but I definitely think I'm missing a few there. So the gist of it is this work does have value, but I would caution you to read at your own risk. And the last book I'm going to talk about today is The Other Man by Farhad J. Dadyburjor. The main character in The Other Man is Ved Mehra. He's a vice president, I believe, at a big company in Mumbai called Miura Electronics. The company was built by his dad, and Ved is set to inherit it one day. At the beginning of the story, we kind of see him just getting by. He works too much, doesn't really have any interests outside of work, and is dealing with a secret heartbreak. Ved is gay, and several years before, he was in a relationship with a guy he believed was the love of his life. So Ved still hasn't really gotten over him. He basically just threw himself into work instead of dealing with this. So we have this picture of Ved's kind of lonely life at the beginning of the story, and then things get worse when his mother begins pressuring him to get married himself. Ved has not come out to his parents yet, and this story begins just before Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code was ruled unconstitutional in regard to consensual homosexual relations in 2018. So Ved doesn't just have to worry about what his parents and society will think if he comes out as gay. He also has to worry about the legal ramifications of being out as well. He's under a lot of pressure and finds himself engaged to a woman named Disha, whose family is also part of high society in Mumbai. His engagement sort of becomes this runaway train he wants to stop, but he feels powerless to do anything about. And just as all this is happening, he meets Carlos Silva, an American expat who is temporarily working in India, and the sparks fly. After years of mourning his ex, Ved is finally starting to feel things for another person. And while it's beautiful, it feels like it could not have happened at a worse time for Ved. This is a romance, so there is a happy ending. The thing that stuck out to me the most about this reading experience was the almost tangible emotional tension I felt as Ved made each discovery, each mistake, each decision. In my opinion, his internal conflict felt very authentic. This was another book where the characters felt very alive to me. I could picture them so clearly in my mind. It was really heartwarming and cathartic. Yes, I did just Google the word cathartic to make sure that I knew what it meant. Anyway, that is everything I read for Asian Readathon in the first half of May. I have officially fulfilled the first, second, and third challenge. I've also actually fulfilled the fifth challenge as of filming this video, but I will cover that at the end of the month. In my end of the month video, I should be talking about The Kiss Quotient by Helena. Aisha at Last by Uzma Jalaluddin, Silence by Shusaku Endo, and hopefully The Ivory Key by Akshaya Raman. So it's only going to get better. Anyhow, thanks for watching. If my brand of awkward appeals to you, please feel free to like this video, subscribe to my channel, or follow me on social media, which I will list below. And until next time, have a cathartic day. Please don't unsubscribe. Bye!